Hello there. I'd like to talk a little bit about various exchanges that happened during the war in Bosnia. I'm talking about the exchange of prisoners, bodies, people who were stuck in the wrong place on the wrong side of the front line, and exchanging even of occasionally commodities for commodities between the warring parties. Now, why would this be an issue that's interesting to listen to and important to learn about? Well, the answer is very simple. You can either encourage dialogue and pragmatic exchanges between the parties, or you can stay out of it and let them, invariably not, do the same thing. One thing is clear, that in an age now where there are many more non-state actors than state actors, the guidance in the Geneva Conventions, which are at the end of a formal conflict between two parties, there shall be a full exchange of both prisoners and bodies from the battlefield, is simply only partially relevant. There's much else that needs to be done, and this particular discussion will talk about them. So, I was involved in the exchange between the conflicting parties in the former Yugoslavia, in the exchange of almost 1,100 bodies and very close to 400 prisoners of war during the actual conflict. I maintain that the informal contacts and the communication between the parties that these negotiations entailed not only helped in a humanitarian way for next of kin to find where the bodies were and to sometimes be reunited with someone who'd been taken prisoner, but also helped to allow passage of other communications between the higher levels non-attributably to each other and help them communicate and get on. So the two exchanges I want to talk about in particular this afternoon, one is an exchange in Gorazde, which turned out to be completely asymmetric. The Muslims were surrounded in the Gorazde pocket, the enclave, and they had some prisoners of the Serbs, and the Serbs had access to their, controlled all access to their enclave. So humanitarian convoys could not get through. And essentially the basis of that deal was food for prisoners, completely in contravention of everything that the Geneva Convention stood for, yet I maintain very much necessary for helping out that situation. The second exchange I want to talk about happened towards the end of the conflict. It happened in the northwest corner of Bosnia, outside a little village called Izičić, which is now a main crossing point between Bosnia and Croatia. And it involved three factions. So the negotiations and mediations between the factions were exponentially more difficult than just the difficult negotiations normally associated with two factions. So let's look at the issue with respect to the two factions, the two exchanges, and compare them. Here you can see the key dynamics in each exchange. In Gorazde, as I've already admitted, the Geneva Convention did not sanction the exchange of prisoners of war for food convoys. However, it was done, that was the basis, and the reason why the parties couldn't conduct it themselves. In fact, there were 4 unregistered secret prisoners. All prisoners of war are supposed to be registered with International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and they then send delegates to visit frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes every couple of days, to check on the conditions of detention and the conditions of the prisoners. But secret unregistered prisoners couldn't be checked on by anybody. It was always the contention of the Serb side that there were secret unregistered prisoners, and of the Muslim side that there were none. I spent a lot of time shuttling between the two civil authorities, crossing the front line sometimes twice in a day, in a soft-skin vehicle that could have its own challenges. And gradually, as I got to know the personnel on the Serb side, I said to them, look, I would like to believe you, but you've got to show me evidence. Why do you think there are unregistered prisoners? And they started to produce from the family members who I was introduced to tiny little bits of circumstantial evidence, little scraps of paper that could be taken out underneath of the prison, underneath the fingernail of a guard and passed on, just with the name of a family dog or something like that, that only the prisoner could know. This, by the way, is proof of life, and any of you who are thinking of going out into the field should go through the exercise of proof of life, proof of death. Look it up. It's important. If you're serious and sensible and professional, you'll do it. So I gradually became convinced that there was something to their stories with the proof of life that I was shown. So I went to the civilian authorities on the Muslim side and I said, guys, I want to believe you when you tell me absolutely sincerely that you have no secret prisoners. Trouble is, there's a slowly accumulating weight of circumstantial evidence that's coming against you, and that if this was ever proven, then you would be in convention of so many international conventions, it would be very, very damaging to your side. Now, I can understand how sometimes civil authorities are misled by the security services, because that's what they did with everything all the time in the former Yugoslavia. They ran policy and practice according to their own ideas, not according to what they were told by civil authority. Well, one morning I was walking through the street and the ICRC delegate came up to me in the street and was both happy and furious at me and said, "How did you do it?" I said, "Do what?" They said, "This morning 4 prisoners have been registered with ICRC, being held in the same prison that we have been visiting these last 18 months. I said, "I've no idea how that happened, but I'm so pleased. It means that we can get things going." And it did. The final path took us through many meandering negotiations, and after the idea of the prisoners being registered, and we got the green light in principle, then people wanted to add medical supplies coming into the pocket, 7 large food convoys from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and we even got down to 150 kilograms of glue to repair shoes, because it was very needed after years of not having access to that sort of stuff. Every time we hit a roadblock, we just agreed to make the package bigger. You can very rarely go back and deconstruct, but you can often find a balance between the parties by just keep making the problem bigger. In fact, I believe the late President Eisenhower in America had a policy of, if you're stuck, make the problem bigger. And that's what happened basically with in broad terms, with the situation in Goražde. Now, if we look at the situation for Izečich, it was slightly different. We were dealing only with an exchange of prisoners in Izečich. However, having to deal with 3 parties rather than 2 parties made the situation exponentially more difficult, because when A and B were adjusting what you might call their exchange rate of prisoners, C was watching and realizing they could possibly leverage either A or B in a different way for themselves. Or C found out they weren't watching. These bilaterals were never conducted with any other party present, but they were always talked about in plenary eventually. So it was extremely difficult to get 3 parties to agree. One of the things that differentiated Izečich from Goražde was such an important strategic deal for the eastern part of Bosnia. It was described in one book as the biggest thing that happened in 1994 in eastern Bosnia. In Goražde, they had to go to their national authorities, to their notional presidents, to get final clearance. In Izečich, it was left to the exchange commissions and the guys on the ground to do it, and that cut out one level of difficulty that they had there. And one observation that was often true of these body exchanges, the conflict was 3 years old, and about 50% at any time of the bodies that were being exchanged would be from the conflict. But there would always be bodies that were older than the conflict. And this was both disturbing and essential. Why? It was understood amongst the warring parties that the people like the International Committee of the Red Cross would be looking very carefully at the treatment of prisoners, prisoners of war, and the battlefield bodies. And so therefore there was much less chance of monkey business. And let me say this now, The ICRC are the very best at that sort of thing. They work only in the obvious domain because they're constrained by the Geneva Conventions, but they work meticulously and they work honestly, and they are almost never, ever up to any kind of monkey business whatsoever. You occasionally get one or two delegates who are a little bit like that, but believe me, they're found out very quickly and disposed of by ICRC very quickly. The best integrity of any organization I've worked with in the field. So why these ancient bodies? Well, the ancient bodies are because in every conflict there are people who understand once they've run away they're never going to go back to that home. And yet that home, that village where the people have been for generations, where their parents or grandparents are buried, and they wanted bodies exhumed and brought back so that they could be reburied near a new home. Not everybody felt like that, but many people felt like that. And they were not covered by ICRC scrutiny at all. And therefore, you could go to one of the commission members on your side and say, if you can get my mum and dad back, there's 500 euros in it for you. And that was what was happening, and it was clear that it was what was happening, and you had to take a position on that. And my position was this: I didn't let them talk about that sort of thing in front of me. I would always give them an opportunity to talk privately, the parties, where they could talk about that sort of thing if they wanted to, and they never ever informed me later about it. I had put my telescope to my blind eye, I saw no signal, and I carried on. Again, some of you will think that that is an immoral thing to do. I think that it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do in encouraging genuine dialogue between the parties of a pragmatic nature, and anything that got them together was better than them firing shells at each other across the front line. So, if we look at the final analysis with the Cynefin framework, we will see that the venue, the security, the witness and communications on site are all to do with the obvious domain, and they are for you to supervise, but to detail off to other agencies. The military and the civilian police are always interested in that sort of thing. Get them to do it. In the plenary and bilateral discussions, the mediator has two different profiles, and this is very important. When you're bilaterally meeting with one of the parties, you can be tough, you can be truthful, you can say that's not going to fly. Frankly, even I don't believe half of that, let alone what the others who know you better than I do will believe. And that's your role, to be the voice of truth to that party. When you're meeting in plenary, you take a very laid back, very soft touch position. You never call someone a liar at the table, even if they're lying through their teeth. You never accuse a party of acting in bad faith. What you can do is say, I think that we've possibly reached a natural pause if we break for coffee now, and I'd like to see party A in the breakout room. And then everybody has coffee. You go and have a bilateral with party A, and you really tell them what you feel you've got to tell them. And if they come back with the same bad faith, the same bad story, then you know what it is they're doing. But never call them out in public. You call them out in private. And in public, you just let it float along. And when you sense that they're close to a general agreement, you say something like, I can tell that the parties are starting to understand each other. We're slowing proceedings down by having to interpret and translate for the international representatives gathered here present. I am now clearing the room of all international representatives and the translators and myself, and I will leave the two parties across the table facing each other so long as the heads of each of the delegations agrees with me that they are happy to do that. And then the head of delegation on one side will nod and the other one will nod, and you will leave, or one nods and one doesn't nod and gives you a negative sign. So you say, I think maybe we have to do a little more in plenary. Anyway, when you leave them alone is their chance to strike the dirty deal, to have that disgusting little codicil which would upset you if it was done in front of you. But if it's not done in front of you and you have no idea, they can't come to you afterwards and say they cheated. I didn't see it. I didn't witness it. I will put my name to everything I witnessed, but I will not put my name to stuff that you tell me is true and they will tell me when I go and ask them about it is not true. And that's basically how you conduct your main part of your exchange mediation. As the process matures, you can leave the parties, as I say, to get to talk about stuff on their own. And if bad faith is happening, you can all you can do is break, walk away, and hope that that they can come to an agreement about something later. Because there will always be, if there is bad faith, it's almost always because something has happened elsewhere in the general sphere of combat, thereby they've been told by the national authority to just stop their negotiations and wait for a new set of parameters. However, I can say that in the purely body exchanges that I was involved in, and it was almost 1,100 bodies. This Izhich was the biggest one I ever did, which was 112 bodies. So you can see that there were lots and lots of exchanges of 12, 15, 20, 30 bodies. I never actually caught the parties in bad faith about which bodies they were going to exchange. They did it, and they did it well. And that's really all I want to say about exchanges.